Welcome to this session on theories and models of substance abuse treatment approaches. Uh, when we talk about these models, it's important to keep in mind that we're really looking at some of the general parameters and general requirements pertaining to these different models. So in this lecture, what we're going to do is just talk about and identify 11 different models related to substance abuse treatment and some of the basic components and characteristics related to these models. First model we're going to look at is the disease model, also known as the medical model. And with this model, what's very different about it compared to other models, this is the only model that is also known as the American model, and it's only in the US that this model is really the premise of all substance abuse treatment. Some of the components and characteristics pertaining to the medical model. First of all, this model says that the disease of substance abuse or chemical dependency is chronic in nature. And what that simply means is that once an individual has contracted or becomes addicted or become alcoholic, once they contract that condition or that disease according to this model, they have that disease until death. It's a permanent situation. Also, the chronicity of substance abuse, according to the medical model, is that it is incurable. Because you will have it for life, you cannot cure it. It is also considered to be irreversible. And what this simply means is that whatever damage that has been caused by the substance to the body, you cannot change that, it cannot be taken away, and it cannot be reversed. That damage is permanent. However, with this medical model, if an individual receives treatment in appropriate time, the damage stops where it is. It does not get worse, but it cannot be reversed or it will not go away. The second characteristic of the medical model is that it is progressive. And what this simply means is that it has a definite course of action, and with this course of action, there are definite identifiable symptoms. In other words, what we will see as the disease becomes more progressive is that there will be certain types of behaviors, certain types of physical as well as psychological symptoms, and these symptoms will be readily identifiable. And over time, what will happen in this progression, if the person continues to use a substance, those symptoms will become more identifiable, they will become more permanent, and they will have a definite course of action. So that is the second characteristic, is that it is a progressive disease or disorder. The third component or characteristic of the medical or disease model is that it is predictable. And what this simply means is that there are consequences that are foreseeable. If an individual engages in the behavior, then you can anticipate what those outcomes will be as a result of using that substance. Also, as the progression of the addiction continues, the consequences become more common and they become more obvious. So in other words, you can almost guess what is going to happen to someone as they engage in substance abuse behavior, and if they continue to engage in this behavior, then it's going to become worse over time. The fourth characteristic of the disease or medical model is that it has primariness about it. And what this means is that chemical dependency or substance abuse is a disease in and of itself. In other words, it is not a symptom of some other underlying disorder. The disease itself, the substance abuse, is the problem. The chemical dependency causes symptoms. Symptoms do not cause the dependence. So that is what we mean when we say it is the primary disease. It is a disease within itself. It is not a characteristic or a symptom of some other manifestation. Now, while it is true that alcohol use may be used as a coping strategy for other problems, it is still a disorder in and of itself because it has primary symptoms. The fifth characteristic of the medical model is that it is fatal. There's a certain type of fatality attached to this model, especially if the dependency or the chemical abuse goes undiagnosed. If it goes undiagnosed and it goes untreated, the chemical dependency will result in early fatality. The next component of the medical or disease model is that it is arrestable. And what this means is that if the addiction, if the abuse, if the disease is diagnosed and successfully treated, recovery is the most complete of all diseases. Now, again, it is important to point out that once the diagnosis has occurred and the individual stops using the substance, the damage stops at that point. The damage cannot be reversed, but it does not get worse in terms of physical symptoms and characteristics if the person stops using the substance. And this is particularly true of alcohol use and alcohol abuse. That was the medical model. The next model that is commonly used when we look at addictions is a social learning models. And there are a series of models in the social learning model, but what I want to do is just kind of touch a bit on what are some of the characteristics of the general models. Also, if we go back for a second to the medical model, and if you think about the medical model as being the disease in and of itself, you have to say, what type of intervention will work best with this condition? Well, the intervention includes to identify the alcohol or the substance, inform the client, or according to the medical model, the patient, of their condition. The individual then has to accept that diagnosis, and then they have to pursue a course of abstinence. And abstinence is considered to be one of the keys to treatment or intervention when we look at the medical model. And this is a treatment of physical problems according to the medical model. Because keep in mind, the medical model may not be dismissing psychological behaviors and psychological effects, but the medical model says that it is the physical characteristics, the physical symptoms that must be treated. So that is what the medical model will focus on in terms of intervention, treating the physical problems as a result of the chemical dependency. Now, let's move back to the social learning models. The social learning models, basically, according to this model, it extends problem behavior theory by suggesting that behavior patterns will be more or less problematic depending on opportunities and social influences to which one is exposed. This model also says that skillfulness with which one performs those behaviors that the individual engages in, and the balance of reward one receives for participation in the activities. Now, so what the social model is saying is that an individual will engage in drinking or in drugging because participation or engagement in that behavior yields some type of reward for the user. And substance use is conceptualized as a socially learned, purposeful, and functional behavior, which is the result of the interplay of social and environmental and personal factors. So in other words, this model says that an individual will continue to engage in the behavior because they're getting something out of it. There's something very rewarding about using the substance, and that's a learned behavior, and it's learned because of what we see and how we interact within a social context. So that model will say the person will continue to use or continue to drink simply because they're getting some type of reinforcement, some type of reward from using the substance. Now, this model, the social learning model, has certain areas in which it places emphasis. According to the social learning model, or also known as the SLM model, it emphasizes modeling as one of its components. In other words, substance use behaviors and peer pressure is another reason, according to this model, why people engage in the behavior. It's the old monkey see, monkey do kind of a syndrome. So just as children observe their parents and they learn from their parents' behavior, that's what happens with individuals when they use a substance. They will see others engaging in this. It's socially acceptable. There's some reward attached to this type of behavior. So the individuals will do what they see. They will do what is being modeled to them and participate in that. Another emphasis area with the social learning model is on the area of coping skills. And coping skills simply refers to the use of a substance as a strategy for coping with problems or altering one's psychological state. And this is the part where an individual will use a substance to deal with stress, to deal with day-to-day living problems. And what they really want to do here is gain some type of mental break, some type of mental escape from the problems they're dealing with. And this is what is also known as psychological dependence. That is the reason why the person really relies quite heavily on the substance in order to function. The third area of emphasis with the social learning model is cognitive processes. Now, cognitive processes says that an individual will engage in the behavior because they have expectations about the effects of the substance. And typically, the expectation is that they will have some kind of positive effect from using the substance. And here, positive does not refer to the impact and the symptomology related to physical difficulties, but the expectation is that this positive reinforcement or this positive expectation means they're going to feel better. It's going to make them maybe have more confidence in themselves. So that positive expectation is what's going to promote some type of frequent use for the individual. Now, it's also important to remember that when individuals engage in any kind of behavior, it's based on some type of expectation. If you could take any example in day-to-day life of why you do something other than having it being required, but when you engage in a behavior, when you're even thinking about engaging in a behavior, you're already anticipating what the outcome will be. Now, if you think it's going to be positive, you're more than likely going to engage in that behavior. But if you think that outcome is going to be negative, you're going to take steps to avoid engaging in that or experiencing the outcome because you know it's going to be negative, it's going to be painful. But according to the social learning model, individuals who engage in substance use tend to do it because they already have the expectation that their participation in using the substance is going to create something positive for them. So they go into it up front with the expectation that they're going to achieve their expected outcome, with that expected outcome being positive. And positive here again means that it's going to alter, it's going to change, it's going to help them escape from whatever pressures they're dealing with. Now, when you think about the cognitive part of the expectations of already thinking about what's going to happen, this is what sets the tone for what types of intervention that you really need to use with these individuals. And the intervention in general should focus on altering the person's relationship to his or her environment. And here, keep in mind that environment is not just physical space. Environment also refers to people within that environment. So sometimes what may happen when you're talking about using the cognitive processes to change the person's behavior, when you think about the modeling and also the coping skills of what has to happen through intervention, that means you can't hang out with the same people you used to hang out with, because typically the people you've been hanging out with are those individuals who are also using or abusing some type of substance. And that, again, is an expectation, because these are my friends. These are the people who make me feel better. And what we do together, in this case, the substance use, the expectation is, well, we're going to feel better because we engage in this behavior. So that will be a part of intervention, is you have to alter the relationships the person has with the environment, including people and places. And you would also have to alter the individual's expectations, keeping in mind that this engagement in the use of a substance, and I'm expecting it to be very good and very positive. So up front, as a part of the intervention or treatment approach, we're going to have to start talking about what are some of the negative consequences of using a substance, and that it does not make you feel better, that it's not a permanent arrangement, and it's not a permanent solution. So intervention would help the individual focus on, okay, what are some of the negative outcomes of engaging in this behavior? Now, our third model is a temperance model. Now, the temperance model emphasizes the use of substances, and in this particular case, it's really talking about the use of alcohol. It's talking about using alcohol in moderation and with caution because of the hazardous nature of the drug. Now, what this is saying is that it is the drug, it's the chemical components within the drugs that are hazardous. And because the chemical components are hazardous, and if you use too much of it, the expectation is you're definitely going to have some negative consequences. So according to this model is, because it has those dangerous or hazardous components and ingredients in it, that's why you have to use it in moderation. Now, the temperance model does not say you do not use or that you must maintain abstinence. What this model says is that if you are going to drink, then you must do it in moderation. It is the excessive use of alcohol in this case that will cause you problems. So if you drink, you must do it in moderation, and you must be aware of the hazardous effects of the chemical components within alcohol. Now, something else to remember about this temperance model and is that it often gets confused with the moral model, and we will talk about the moral model in a few minutes. But the primary difference between the temperance model is that it says moderation, whereas the moral model says abstinence because it is seen as a sin or a weakness. Like I said, we will talk a bit more about the components and the definition for the moral model in a minute. But back to this temperance model, keeping in mind that there was a time in the U.S. when this model was very prominent, and this model was really prominent in the early 20th century, because what it did was it legislated people's behavior about alcohol use. It was around 1919 when the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution made it a criminal act to manufacture, sell, transport, and import alcoholic beverages. And then in the 1920s, this amendment was ratified into law. And if you think about this period, this was the period commonly referred to as the Prohibition period. And it wasn't until 1933 that the 21st Amendment legalized alcohol again. So this model says that one must either return to the social norm of abstinence or progress on towards alcoholism and death. It especially if an individual did not use in moderation, but there are some basic core assumptions related to the temperance model. The first core assumption is that the cause of substance abuse problems is the substance itself. Keep in mind that we also saw this as a part of the social learning model because of the expectations. But according to the temperance model, it's the substance. It's what goes into the substance that is the cause of the problem. The second core assumption is that the drug contains addictive and destructive power. This is looking simply at the pharmacology of the substance. And it says that the pharmacological properties of the drug itself is where the problems lie. Those are the two basic core assumptions about the temperance model. Now, the thing that's interesting about this model, however, is that this is the model that says it's simply the ingredients of alcoholic beverages that leads to addiction. And by holding that premise, this model contradicts or challenges the assumption of all of the other models, because all of the other models give you another explanation of the addiction. But this one simply says it is the ingredients of the substance that causes the problems. Now, if you think about that, if that's what the problem is, what do you think about when you start thinking about intervention or treatment approaches? Well, one thing would be that this model says you have to exhort temperance, which means moderation, or you have to go with abstinence by those who practice it. Also, with the intervention here would be something you typically won't think about in terms of treatment, but it's social legislation. And social legislation means some type of laws, some type of belief, some type of enactment or ratification that is put into place to control several factors. Now, you cannot keep in mind, you cannot keep people from drinking or engaging in drugging. But social legislation says we can put some parameters around that, particularly as it relates to legalized substances such as alcohol. The social legislation would be put into place as an intervention to do several things. One, it would be put into place to control the cost. How much people will be charged for the substance, in this case, alcohol. Now, you also see a similar thing that's going on or related to cigarettes and the use of tobacco. There are certain states that have a very high tax on cigarettes and they have a very high price on the pack of a cigarette. And the belief is that if it costs so much, then one way to control is you price it out of people's reach who want to use it. Another aspect of the social legislation is to dictate availability of the substance. Again, we see this both with alcohol and with tobacco products. Where can you purchase it? there was a time that we used to have vending machines with cigarettes in them in public buildings, and that made availability or accessibility available to everyone. So what legislation has done is now you no longer see those machines in buildings because it controls availability. And the third component of the social legislation is that promotion of alcohol to the general public. The way it's done is a way to control access. And in some places, we have what we refer to as dry counties. And these dry counties simply mean that alcohol is not available in that county. There is no way you can purchase it legally because it is against the law to sell alcohol in dry counties. So those are the areas you really have to think about if you go with the temperance model in terms of intervention. You will either have to use moderation to abstinence, or you will have to have some kind of social legislation according to the temperance model in order to have effective intervention and treatment for individuals who use and abuse substances, particularly alcohol and tobacco. Now, the next model is the moral model, and this is the model that is often confused with the temperance model. They are very different models. According to the moral model, it emphasizes that people engage in substance use, and that engagement in substance use leads to problems because people make a personal choice to use and or abuse a substance. Now, this has taken various forms when we look at the components of the moral models. And according to this model, substance use, substance abuse, chemical dependency is a sin because the person who engages in this behavior causes harm to self and to others. Another component of the moral model is that it is a spiritual deficit. And here it's saying that the person is lacking something within him or herself, and that is related to them being a spiritual being. And it's because of this deficit that the person makes the willful choice to engage in the behavior. If you think about the spiritual deficit, this is the approach that Alcoholics Anonymous use in terms of intervention. And even though AA is calling it spiritual, a lot that is related to the moral model is that it is also religious in nature, even though AA does not deal with it from a religious perspective. But you will see those overtones in the AA philosophy in their approach to treatment. The third component of the moral model is that it is understood as demonic possession. Okay. And if you think about the language itself, demonic, demons, some kind of possession by demons. And these overtones still exist in our language today. You can go into a restaurant or into a bar. You can look at a sign on a bar, and what you will see is them referring to alcohol as spirit. There was a time, and it's in many ways still yet today, we refer to alcohol as the demon rum. And so it's saying that it is because of this demonic possession that people sin, people make poor choices, and because they are possessed, they still willfully engage in this substance abuse behavior. Another component of this moral model is that because people engage in the behavior, they make the choice to use substance, they willfully violate societal rules and norms. Now, an example of this is that when an individual decides to drink or drug, they get into a car and drive, and they get a DUI. So that's considered a willful violation of society's rules and norms because the person made the choice to do that. Again, keep in mind this is according to the moral model. Now, this is an interesting one because people who either explicitly or implicitly willfully violate societal rules and norms have to face certain consequences. And in 1988, the U.S. Supreme Court dealt with the issue of whether alcoholism is a disease beyond the person's control and for which the person is accountable. This pertained primarily to individuals who engaged in some type of criminal behavior while they were under the influence of a substance. And what this 1988 U.S. Supreme Court ruling did, it said that if a person indeed engages in a behavior while under the influence of a substance, it does not excuse that behavior. In other words, a person is totally responsible for the behavior, and the substance use or being under the influence is not an excuse for engaging in the behavior. So the moral model basically is saying is that if you engage in the behavior, you do it by choice. It is not like the medical model where it's a disease. It is not like the social learning model where you see a certain behavior model and you participate in it. And it's not an expectation of outcomes. It is simply your choice to do this. And the moral model says you do this because of some type of spiritual or internal weakness. So when we think about what would be an approach for intervention with the moral model, go back and look at what the basic premise is: choice, spiritual deficit, a sin. So one approach for intervention would be to approach it from religious practices or religious intervention. It is also considered a willful violation of societal rules and norms. So another treatment approach would be punishment for engaging in the behavior, and even more so if that engaging in that behavior led to some type of criminal behavior. So incarceration is what the moral model would push as a result of the willful violation of societal rules and norms. Our next model consists of educational models. And the educational model at the very core of these models is that substance abuse problems evolve from a knowledge deficit or a lack of information. According to this model, people engage in the behavior because, one, they don't understand the consequences. They don't have adequate information to know that this is harmful or hazardous, and if they did, they wouldn't engage in it. So this model also says that with correct knowledge, individuals are presumed to be less likely to use substances in a hazardous manner and to suffer the consequences. So basically it says if we give individuals information, if we give them accurate information, they won't engage in the behavior. And some examples of educational programs would be the DARE program, MAD, some type of school-based intervention programs. So the intervention from the educational model is, well, let's look at education and let's look at motivation to change the behavior or to avoid engaging in the behavior altogether. And educational models are very common in treatment programs, and they're also used in conjunction with other types of models or treatment approaches. Our next model, number 6, is the characterological models. And these models are also commonly referred to as psychoanalytic models. And what that simply means is that these are dealing with character flaws. The characterological models emphasize the roots of substance dependence is in abnormalities of personality. People who are paranoid, people who are schizophrenic. This model says that those people who engage in substance abuse, it is because of those character flaws, because of those personality deficits. And the resolution of substance abuse requires a restructuring of the personality. So this one, unlike other models, is not blaming modeling. It is not blaming or saying that it is a medical disease. It is not saying that it's the chemical properties of the substance. It is basically saying that individuals have some type of character flaw. And because of this character flaw, that is why they engage in the behavior, and you have to change the person's character in order to change their behavior or to treat them for any kind of addiction. Also with this stage, what we know is that it represents a fixation at a point in life. Keep in mind, we're talking psychoanalytic here. So this model says that there is some type of an early fixation of normal psychological development involving unresolved conflicts regarding dependence. And because the person has this type of fixation, and keep in mind when we're talking about the fixation, what we're really talking about here is the oral fixation at the stage of that development. And this model basically says that because a person becomes fixated at that oral stage, which relates to the literal sucking of a bottle, those who engage in alcohol abuse is fixated at that oral stage, and therefore that is one explanation for the use. We're also seeing that people who are fixated at this stage, according to the psychoanalytic model, tend to engage in other type of oral fixation behaviors, the excessive chewing of gum. So it is the unresolved conflict that occurred at that point of fixation that leads to the substance abuse and the oral fixation. So that is something that needs to be explored. This model also talks in some detail about alcoholism arising from latent homosexuality. This is one hypothesis. Also that it arises from low self-esteem. Individual may have sex role conflicts or a drive for power and control by persons who feel particularly impotent. And impotent here means lack of control over things, or they feel powerless. The central assumption is that alcoholics are people with particular personality types, and the only way to change the addiction is you have to restructure the personality. Now, what will be the intervention? Clearly, one is going to be psychotherapy to resolve the basic underlying conflicts and bring the person to a more mature level of functioning. Our next models consist of conditioning models. Now, the basic principles here deal with classical and operant conditioning. The classical conditioning, if you think back to B.F. Skinner, is the simple stimulus response theory, the role of learning in shaping substance use behavior. Now, the premise of the model is that excessive substance use is a learned habit. We've heard that someplace before. In some ways, this is related to the social learning model. Also, Skinner's conditioning principles believe that if substance use leads to rewarding consequences, it is likely to continue or to increase. Okay? This plays back into what we saw earlier with our social learning model and the expectations. A person will engage in the behavior because They expect it to do something. And Skinner is saying, according to the principles of conditioning, once a person engages in it, and if the consequences are rewarding or positive for that individual, more than likely the person is going to continue to engage in it, or they're going to increase their frequency and intensity of engaging in that behavior. Now, if you think about this model, what it is saying is, if you really think about it, the same principles that a person used to learn this behavior and engage in this behavior can be used to help the individual relearn behavior patterns. So if it's rewarding, you have to find a way to help people learn how that it's not rewarding. The intervention here, of course, will be classical intervention. And this may consist of aversion therapies, such as drug therapies. One that is not used anymore and created a lot of controversy, such as electric shock. Lithium has been used as an intervention according to the conditioning model. Imagery is also a very big one that is used when we talk about using or changing behaviors. And with the operant perspective of operant conditioning with this model, community reinforcement approaches may also be used. Anabuse is a drug that's commonly used to treat substance abuse according to the conditioning model. And social and recreational activities and restructuring can be used, and helping individuals learn social skills. So social skills training is an intervention that individuals can use if the intervention is prescribed to using the conditioning model. So simply what this model is saying, for any type of intervention for substance abuse, you want to help people unlearn the behavior and relearn new behaviors. So classical and operant condition is what is reinforced with this model. The next models consist of biological models. And biological models simply emphasize that there is some type of genetic and physiological process that cause substance dependence. You may also see this model referred to as the heredity model. Some points to be aware of when we talk about the biological of the heredity model. One is that hereditary factors exist. And what this means is that children of substance abusers have a higher risk of substance abuse problems. Are we saying that because you are the child of an alcoholic or an addict that you will be? No. But what we are saying is that you are at a higher risk, you have a higher probability of engaging in the behavior. There have been some studies on the alcohol gene. Those studies have not been conclusive. Some studies say, yes, there is an alcohol gene, whereas others say they're not. We've also seen twin studies, where the twin studies look at identical twins, and one twin may be a substance abuser and the other one is not. So these studies were used to try to identify the hereditary factor. So what the studies basically concluded were that there were some children who were substance abusers because of the parents, whereas the other child did not. The other child went the totally opposite direction, did not engage in the behavior at all. So the hereditary factor is a possibility for substance abuse. It has not been proven conclusively to be, but studies continue to identify the alcohol gene. Another characteristic of the biological model is that individuals may have unique biological conditions, and these unique biological conditions may predispose the individual to substance dependence or substance abuse. And a biological condition consists of abnormal metabolism, It could be some type of unique brain sensitivity. And because of these conditions, the person is at a greater risk. And this perspective is similar to the medical model. It is saying that there is something physiological, something biological, something within the body of the individual that may explain the explanation for substance use and substance abuse. Also, this model believes that there's a certain pharmacology of alcohol. And what the pharmacology again deals with is simple chemical properties of the drug. And it is saying that it is those chemical properties of the drug that explain how the drinking or the drugging can escalate. So the person will engage in abuse of a substance simply because the properties of the drug. If you think about intervention, we're talking about hereditary factors here. So clearly genetic counseling is going to be an approach that can be used for intervention. And also, because the person may be at risk and predisposed and have no control over that predisposition, caution, using preemptive approaches in counseling about the potential of outcomes and consequences for substance use is another approach that one can use when we talk about interventions for substance abuse based on the biological model. The next approach consists of the general systems model. Now, the general systems model views individual behavior as an inherent part of a larger social system. The actions of the individual cannot be understood without considering their relationship to other members and levels of the system to which the individual belongs. And this model basically maintains that a system, and here the system refers to the family, tends to maintain an overall status quo. And because of that, that system or that family will resist change. And in order to change the behavior, to stop the drinking, to stop the drugging, as a counselor or an interventionist, you're going to have to work with both the individual and the family. And a classic example of this is when you're working with children of alcoholics or adult children of alcoholics who manifest a unique kind of pathology as a result of the dysfunction within the family and what goes on within that atmosphere in which they were raised. Now, our next model is the social cultural models. The social cultural models says that there is still a larger viewpoint to the role of society and subculture in changing the individual's drinking patterns or drugging patterns and the related problems. And basically what this model does is it takes the general systems model to another step. And it really looks at not just the family, the immediate family and environment, but it looks at society as a whole, and it looks at subcultures in which the person participates that may shape that person's behavior. Now, also as a part of that subculture, it could be simply the neighborhood in which a person lives, because availability varies from neighborhood to neighborhood, such as cost will also vary, convenience of access, and legal regulations are examples of that subculture that may help to explain why a person engages in the behavior. And what we do know is that in certain neighborhoods, you can go and you will see within a 1, 2, or 3 block radius more alcohol beverage stores than you will see anyplace else. And you can go into other neighborhoods and they're not there. It is again because of zoning that dictates availability. So if you're living in a community where it's readily available, according to the social cultural model, that is something that has to be addressed. And the person needs to be aware of that. And we also know that pricing varies. The level of per capita alcohol consumption in society, for example, is powerfully influenced by these factors: the availability of the substance, the cost of the substance, the convenience, and the codes and regulations that relate to it. We also have to consider the nature of substance use environments. And what we're talking about here is that certain characteristics of a drinking establishment favor heavier drinking. For example, bars have now become legally accountable for the harm inflicted by the drinker who was served at that establishment. But because that's what bars do, they serve alcohol, the more an individual drinks, the more profit. So the characteristic of the establishment simply says that is what we do here. And if the person goes there, the expectation is they're going to engage in that behavior and drink. Other cultural factors that may also be important determinants of the level of alcoholism in society include societal stress, alienation, encouragement or punishment for drunkenness, attitudes about alcohol, and the symbolic or functional importance of alcohol within society. And this is again going to be a cultural determinant. And then you will have subcultural determinants as well. For example, in the U.S., alcohol use is held in high esteem. Alcohol use as a part of culture is linked to celebrations. If we win a football championship or a basketball championship, alcohol is a very big part of that celebration. It becomes a big part of ceremonies. We look at weddings. Alcohol is a part of that culture in the U.S. of weddings. It is also a part of the cultural when it relates to grief and grieving and death and funerals. So it is how the culture defines the use and how it is perceived and around functions. So if the part of the culture says alcohol is something we do, it's important, and it's interwoven in our activities, then that is also, according to the social culture model, permission for an individual to engage. Still not excusing the behavior, but because it's highly acceptable within that culture or within that subculture, then the person, according to the social culture model, engages in the behavior. And we can look at it even more so when we talk about culture and subcultures, when we talk about ethnicity across different ethnic groups of, the attitude, the perception of substance use. And what we see, for example, and this is not to stereotype, but we do see a high rate of consumption among individuals from Irish ethnicity. But we see a very low consumption among individuals from ethnic groups of Asian origin, for example. And we also see a relatively low consumption rate among people of French origin because of the way it's introduced within the culture. Alcohol is not seen as something that is forbidden. It is seen as having a proper place. It is seen as having regulations around how it is used and how it is introduced. It is introduced, for example, very early as a part of meals, not as a substance of abuse. Also, we have to look at the mystery that may be attached to alcohol use that may initiate some curiosity about it. For example, in the U.S., we tend to make alcohol use more of a mystery to children, and they're trying to figure out, because what they are observing is that adults and parents are engaging in this and they seem to be enjoying it. But as children, we're told not to. Now, this is not saying that we want children to engage in it, but it's the way it is introduced. It is the mystery that surrounds how it is used and how it is perceived in this situation between parents and children. Whereas in many of dinner tables in France, it is introduced as a part of the meal and it is to be used in a certain context. So again, culture and subculture bring into play how we perceive alcohol and how we respond to it and how we use it or abuse it according to the sociocultural model. Now, the next model we have is a public health model. Now, the public health model consists of 3 types of causal factors in understanding and intervening with any disease. It's not just related to substance abuse, because keep in mind, it's a public health model, and alcohol, drug addiction are both seen as public health issues. So according to the public health model, the core concept here is that emphasis is placed on the importance of addressing 3 components in this model. Okay? And this model says, regardless of what the condition may be, what the disease may be, we have to address 3 factors in treating or intervening with any kind of disease. And this model does identify substance abuse as a disease. So this model says the first factor we have to consider is the agent. And in the terms of the language of public health, the agent here is referred to as a germ. So the agent itself contains a certain destructive potential. This is going back to the chemical properties of the substance. So this model is saying, okay, let's look at what goes into it, what makes up the substance, because there lies an explanation. The second factor we have to consider is the host factors. And the host here refers to the individual. What is it that is going on with that person? And that could be psychologically, that could be physiologically, emotional, that could be heredity. So this model is saying the host factor, the person, what is it that influences susceptibility to the condition, to substance abuse? Those personal risk factors, including family history, that increase or decrease one's susceptibility to the disease. The third factor of the public health model is the environment. Now, here the environment refers to the means by which the agent, meaning the germ, is spread to the host or to the individual. In alcohol dependence or chemical dependency, emphasis is on aspects of the environment which promote alcohol use and misuse. Now, the interesting thing about this model is it not only looks at the chemical properties, it not only looks at the individual, it brings the environment into the picture to say what are the causal factors. So the hallmark of the core concept of the public health approach is its emphasis on looking at all 3 of these components and their interaction. Now, so this model is basically saying that, yes, there is an acknowledgement that alcohol is a hazardous drug, which places anyone, and the emphasis is on anyone, at risk who consumes it unwisely or beyond moderation. So it's saying, I don't care if there is a predisposition or not. The fact that it has hazardous properties, anyone who uses it runs the risk of becoming addicted if they go beyond the use in moderation. This model also recognizes that there are significant individual differences in susceptibility to alcohol problems, mediated by factors such as heredity, tolerance, brain sensitivity, and metabolism. And that is something you will have to always consider when you're working with individuals who are substance abusers, is individual variation. This model also says that stresses the importance of environmental factors in determining rates of alcohol use and related problems, attending to influences such as availability and promotion of alcohol. So this model is summarized by saying basically you cannot look at any one of these factors, agent, host, or environment, in isolation. It is the interaction of these three factors that really identify causal factors of substance abuse and addiction in individuals. And these are just some of the basic models of substance abuse. Next, I just want to give you a quick summary of the models. Okay, so the first thing you would really want to think about is how can you remember components, important characteristics with these models. One way to do it is just kind of think of examples that emphasize causal factors, what are some of the implied interventions, and appropriate interventionists. Okay, let's look at some examples. With the moral model, for example, what is the moral model? Well, the moral model says that substance abuse and alcohol addiction is seen as a crime. And if it is indeed seen as a crime, what would be causal factors? Well, spiritual deficit, personality, personal responsibility. And if that is what we believe, then how do we intervene? Well, we have to have some kind of spiritual guidance and intervention. We have to have social sanctions. And this is not only to protect the individual from themselves, but to protect the public from the individual. And the interventionists will more likely be the clergy or law enforcement or legislators. So that's a good way to kind of outline a way to see how to address each of these different models. And you can just go through for each model and do this. And I've provided some examples here for you to see how to do this. Now, I think we have had some good discussion around all of these models. But then we also now have to really think about how do we address some of these. How do we intervene? How do we make decisions? And what I'm presenting next is just some information on using the medical model. We'll take that one and talk about decision making in this model. Okay, let's take a look at the disease of the medical model, which is again the American model, and looking at the model as an addiction. Now, the disease model is a dominant model used in the United States for treating alcoholism. Thus, it is frequently referred to as the American model. Let's look at implications of this model. And there are 4 stages to this model. The The first stage says that an individual enters what is known as pre-alcoholic phase. And the pre-alcoholic phase is where alcohol is used for relief from tension. During this phase, the pre-alcoholic phase, the individual experiences some type of loss of control. And the loss of control here refers to the decision to engage in the behavior or not engage in the behavior. And this loss of control is evident in that the person no longer drinks only for social reasons on a social basis, but they're drinking to relieve the stress and the anxiety. So it is not drinking as a social interaction. The drinking becomes purposeful, and the purpose here is to relieve stress and tension. The next phase that the person will enter into is what is called the prodromal phase. And during the prodromal phase, this is where a person will start experiencing blackouts. The person will also have a preoccupation with the use of an alcohol or the use of a drug. So in other words, what is now consuming a considerable part of that person's time and day is preoccupation of wanting to use, how they're going to obtain the drug, when, or the alcohol, when are they going to be able to use it. The person during this phase may also experience development of guilt feelings over behavior while intoxicated. In other words, the person will exhibit some kind of behavior that they normally would not engage in. And it is an embarrassing behavior for the most part. And because they engage in that behavior, when they're sober or when they're thinking clearly, they have some regrets about what they did while they were under the influence. The third phase that the individual enters into is the crucial phase. The crucial phase is characterized by a loss of control over alcohol. The person will also exhibit withdrawal symptoms, and there is a preoccupation with drinking. And this preoccupation, again, is similar to the previous step, in which it was the person was just kind of beginning that. Here is a much more intense preoccupation. The person now may even be planning when within their day they can get to the alcohol or the drug, when they can use it, and how they can basically work it into a schedule. During this crucial phase, this is when we see the development of physical dependence. The person may exhibit loss of self-esteem, symptoms of self-pity. The person will enter into neglect of proper nutrition, keeping in mind that alcohol is high in calories, but they're empty calories because they have no nutritional value. So a person may be drinking a lot, but they're not getting any nutrients. So they're not eating appropriately or properly. They're certainly not getting a balanced diet. They're getting a lot of calories, but they're not getting any nutrients from those calories. The person during this crucial phase may also show signs of attempts to reassert control over alcohol by entering into short periods of abstinence, but only to return to alcohol use. So this may be what you will see during this phase, is a person who says, oh, I can stop drinking whenever I want to. And what happens is, they can stop drinking for a day or two or maybe a week, but they cannot maintain the abstinence because they're now having lost control over the power of to do it or not to do it. And also during this phase, this is when the person enters into what is known as promise making. This is where you may see someone saying, I promise I won't do that again. I'm so embarrassed that happened. I'm really going to do better. So they're making all these promises, maybe in good faith with good intention to do this, but you got to remember here what has happened is the person has lost control over the decision now to use or not to use. So those are really empty promises the individual is making. And then there's a fourth stage, the final stage of alcoholism, which is a chronic phase. And what you will see here in this phase is a loss of tolerance for alcohol. You will see obsessive drinking, and you may even see alcoholic tremors. Now, the loss of tolerance for alcohol here, and what tolerance basically refers to is that an individual takes more to reach the same effect. Okay, the body has made an adjustment, and the one drink or the two drinks just doesn't do it anymore. So they have to increase the frequency and the amount in order to achieve the same rate of euphoria that less alcohol might have achieved. Some of the behaviors you may see during this chronic phase is now that these individuals have lost control, they're preoccupied, and they're now drinking with what may be referred to as social inferiors. People start hanging out with and drinking with. Their drinking buddies become people they normally wouldn't be with. And so it's not uncommon to see a professional now drinking with someone who has publicly been identified as an alcoholic, who has certain behaviors that does not seem to bother that person, but that this professional normally would not do. So they've changed they have lowered their standards, in other words. You may also see during this chronic phase the use of substitutes when alcohol is not available. So what has happened now is a person has gotten to the level that they need the alcohol, and if they have in some way been denied access to it, they start looking for products with ingredients, the ingredient of alcohol, and they will substitute those ingredients, and some of them can be quite deadly. It's not uncommon for people to drink rubbing alcohol because they want the alcohol. Cough medicine has a fairly high percentage of alcohol in it. Mouthwash and something as basic as vanilla extract has an alcohol content. So what the person has now done is, if they have been denied access to liquor, beer, or wine, they're going to take the alcohol in any form they can get it, and they will get it out of other products. One example of what we see with substitution products for alcohol is among the American Indian population, where, as you know, in reservations, alcohol is illegal. So in order to get the alcohol content, they have now reverted to products such as hairspray, which has a very high alcohol content, and you simply drill a hole in the bottom of the can and let the liquid flow out and actually drink it. So it's also not just what's being substituted, it's the hazardous properties within these substitutions that now also pose health risks to the individual engaging in this kind of behavior. So these are the 4 stages of alcoholism according to the medical model. Now, also, when people make a decision about substance use, and here we're still looking at the medical model of addiction and the thought process, the decision-making process used with the medical model. And a series of questions should be asked with the medical model to determine the next direction in the decision-making process of an individual about using substances. The responses are basic yes-no responses, and depending on that response, that will dictate the direction that the decision will go. So the first basic question is simple: does the person choose to use a drug at this time? If the response to that is no, the person abstains and must make this decision not to use on a daily basis. That one's pretty straightforward and pretty dry. So if the person says, no, I'm not going to use, but we're talking about a medical model, there is an addiction, but that decision must be made daily not to use a substance. Now, but what if the answer is yes? Then if the answer is yes, the second question you would ask is, was the chemical rewarding? Again, if the chemical was not rewarding, the person decides not to use the drug again in the near future. But what if the answer was yes? Then the question you will ask is there social reinforcement for further drug use? Again, if the answer is no, the person decides not to use the drug. If the answer is yes, you go to the next question. Is drug use consistent with life goals? No, it is not. So I do not choose to use and will not. But if it is consistent with what the person wants to engage in, the person continues the drug use. And these are just simple questions of how you would determine the next step in working with an individual. And again, this is based on the medical model. We've talked a bit about different models. And these models are not just for alcohol and drug use. They're for any form of addiction. So the models presented address dysfunction and addiction. And when we talk about intervention and working with people who are engaging in dysfunctional or addictive behavior, it's important to consider the sociocultural factors that might give you explanation. It's important to look at the environment in which the person participates, that environment being places, people, that environment also being how it influences the individual. And we must also consider generational differences across different types of addiction. We do know that people, based on their age, have different attitudes and perceptions about substances, and even the type of substances that are appropriate to engage in and not appropriate to engage in. What is the definition of abuse? What is something as simple as the definition of one drink? Again, that's going to vary by age. Some people, for example, may measure one drink based on ounces. Older individuals, especially older men, may define a drink as a pint bottle. So those are some things you really have to look at, the differences across generation and the types of addiction we're engaging in. Now, there are several points to remember here when we talk about addiction. The first point to remember is that addiction is a primary disease. Addiction is not the symptom of something else going on. It is not a subcategory of some other condition. The disease within itself is a primary disease. Addiction is a disease. Not saying that addiction does not occur in unison with other types of diseases and behaviors, but the addiction is not a symptom of something else. It is the disease within and of itself. Another point that is important to remember is that there are multiple effects in the person's social, cultural, psychological, spiritual, and economic life. Addiction is often progressive. Addiction is potentially fatal if it goes undiagnosed and untreated. Addiction is marked by an inability to control the use of the substance or substances.